Welcome back. Part of our continuing series where we talk to experts on the topic of political polarization. We were able to get someone from across the pond, as they say, in Europe, to help us learn about how Americans are behaving. With us today, or we were able to ask one critical question of Professor Andreas Schedler. He works at the Central European University. Andreas Schedler is a senior research fellow at the CEU Democratic Institute. He is head of the research group on de- and re-democratization and a visiting professor at CEU Vienna. He earned his PhD at the University of Vienna. Before joining the CEU, he was a professor of political science at the Center of Economic Teaching and Research in Mexico City. A leading comparative scholar of democracy, democratization, and authoritarianism, he has widely published on authoritarian elections, democratic consolidation, and transition. So, an international expert on democracy and comparative systems. And this was the article that I noticed him in, was he wrote this article in 2023, Rethinking Political Polarization in Political Science Quarterly. Here's roughly what he said. The comparative study of political polarization has been central to current debates on the global crisis of democracy. It has been built on uncertain conceptual foundations, though. Established uses of the concept lack a distinctive semantic core as multiple meanings compete against each other. I agree. On the basis of a broad reading of the comparative literature, I seek to circumscribe the use and reconstruct the core political polarization as an instance of extraordinary democratic conflict. In a first step, I delineate the basic parameters of debate by distinguishing between cluster analytic and conflict analytic approaches, and by specifying the generic type of political conflict that characterizes the polarization of democratic polities. In the second step, I argue for political intolerance as the defining trait of both ideological and social polarization. In a second step, I argue for political intolerance as the defining trait of both ideological and social polarization. In a final step, I introduce a third democratic dimension into the debate, the breakdown of basic democratic trust that leads actors to view their adversaries as enemies of democracy. Such perceptions spell the end of democratic consolidation. When played among democratic enemies, democracy stops being the only game in town. That was his conclusion from this research. So we were able to ask him one question. I want to ask you one question. Do you see any reason to think political polarization will calm down naturally on its own? You're an expert. You just wrote this review of political polarization this year. Do you think it calms down on its own without a superordinate threat like space aliens coming and bringing us all together, as Ronald Reagan alluded to 50 years ago? Dear Marcus, if I may, that's an easy question. The answer is no. The natural tendency for polarization is to escalate. He does not see political polarization in America calming down on its own. Why? Because the natural tendency for polarization is to escalate. And that is from the guy who wrote the study where he said, political polarization is the defining trait of both political intolerance is the defining trait of both ideological and social polarization. So we wrote this study in 2023, thinking about political polarization overall. And he has experience in America and experience in Europe. And he says, generally looking around the globe with all my experience, no, political polarization does not calm down on its own. It naturally tends to get worse. That's from this professor. We'll leave it there. Thank you.